The world is divided into 4 spheres, each sphere divided among continents and nations. Nations are divided by borders and interests. These interests divide the news. We examine the impact of these divisions on people and power. This is Imaginary Lines. Welcome to Imaginary Lines. I'm your host, Michael Fox. On Tuesday, August 4th, the International Organization for Migration released the news that over 2,000 migrants had died this year alone trying to cross the Mediterranean from North Africa to get to Europe. The day after the press release, another migrant ship went down off the coast of Libya, killing dozens. The death toll continues to rise, and the migrant crisis shows no signs of abating. I speak with Greg Feldman, an anthropologist and professor at Simon Fraser University, about the roots of the African migrant crisis that are not being addressed in the news. But first, let's take a look at media in Latin America.
¡Porque vivos se los llevaron! ¡Vivos los queremos! ¡Porque vivos se los llevaron! ¡Vivos los queremos!
As mobilizations have grown over the last year, demanding the safe return of the forcibly disappeared 43 students from Ayotzinapa, one slogan was heard repeatedly. That slogan, Fue el Estado, it was the state, captured the sentiment of millions who knew that the disappearance of these students was not the result of everyday criminals, but rather the Mexican state was responsible. After news broke recently of the murder of photojournalist Ruben Espinosa, activist Nadia Vera, and 3 others in their apartment in Mexico City, anger and frustration has reached a breaking point. Colleagues and activists have been quick to once again pin the blame on the state. The slogan, "It was the state," re-emerged, but transformed into "It is the state." Media outlets have erred in their coverage by highlighting the fact that some journalists are seeking greater guarantees of security from the state. What in fact is happening is that most journalists are calling for the state itself to stop killing them. Mexico is descending further and further into a black hole of impunity. The lines between organized crime and government officials have become ever more blurred. Should news emerge of yet another Mexican journalist killed for exercising his or her profession, media outlets the world over should join in the condemnations so that the international community is clear on one issue, that it is the state. This year alone, according to the International Organization for Migration, nearly 200,000 migrants have risked their lives on the long and dangerous journey from North Africa across the Mediterranean to European shores. The mainstream media has covered the boats that have sunken or been rescued at sea. They've shown images of the migrants arriving on European coastlines. And it has reported the response from European countries, including the European Union's approval in May to use military force to take on migrant smugglers. But both the media and policymakers have largely ignored a deeper discussion of the root causes behind this current African migrant crisis and the increasing death toll in the Mediterranean. Greg Feldman is a professor at the School for International Studies at Simon Fraser University, who specializes in migration. He's the author of The Migration Apparatus: Security, Labor, and Policymaking in the European Union. And his most recent book, We Are All Migrants, was published this year by Stanford University Press. Greg, thank you so much for joining me on Imaginary Lines.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Greg, let's start by talking about the news from the International Organization for Migration, which was released on August 4th. 2,000 migrants have died this year alone. That number seems pretty high. What's going on here?
Well, it seems several things are happening. That there's the uncertain situation in Libya itself, which has been both an opportunity for human smuggling and also an increased risk. It's an opportunity because the normal controls aren't in place that primarily Italy had established with Gaddafi a few years ago. And that creates kind of holes and opportunities in the system to move people through. So they're trying to funnel people through Libya as much as possible. The risk is that you have 2 different governments, I believe, right now, along with a number of militia groups that are actually trying to detain migrants themselves and then hold them for ransom one way or another, or increase the cost of releasing them, or even using them as cheap labor while they hold them in detention.
And where are most of the migrants coming from?
Right now, the biggest numbers are actually coming from Syria because of the conflict in there, and a large number also coming from Eritrea. The one hopes that these are acute crises that will sort of die down before too long, and those flows would stop or at least slow down. And a steadier stream, due more to economic issues, are coming from Western Africa. And there's no reason to think that those will slow down coming from there.
And what's caused this? 3,000 migrants died last year trying to cross into Europe. Has this type of intense migration from North Africa into Europe always taken place across the Mediterranean?
Not at this scale. I mean, the numbers have increased considerably in the last 2 to 3 years. There's a number of factors. I mean, it's the instability in Syria and northern Iraq. There's those kinds of things. There's increased instability in Central African Republic is seeing a lot of people coming through. So it's the geopolitics is a big cause that in the last few years have been particularly intense. The economic push factors coming out of places like West Africa, I mean, these are steadier, more long-term structural issues, which don't show any signs of abating either.
And can you speak to the role of the United States and Europe in North Africa, be it, say, the U.S. invasion of Libya or the war in Syria, that's helped to really spur this migrant crisis?
Well, anytime you try to recreate countries in a different way, I mean, you're going to upset things that work. They might not be just, or they might not be the way working that you want them to, but at least there's a certain kind of stability there, right? And that's not agreeing or disagreeing with things, but just pointing to a fact. When this all changes, you don't know what the result's going to be. I mean, Colin Powell once said about Iraq, if you break it, you own it, in the sense that it's your responsibility. So in that sense, anytime things become destabilized, you just don't know what the effects are going to be. And in Libya, you know, it's not looking terribly good. Syria and ISIS in northern Iraq, it's not looking terribly good. Yeah, I mean, they've had a big effect on what goes on in there, and that's part of the reason, a big part of the reason.
You mentioned the agreement between Libya and Italy. Talk about what things were like before the U.S. invasion of Libya and how that's changed to the way things are now.
Well, not enough. I mean, look at the numbers of people that not surviving these journeys and having to take them in the first place. You know, Mare Nostrum has been criticized for being a pull factor for migrants. And just in case not everybody knows, Mare Nostrum was actually a humanitarian effort that the Italian government ran for a year to go out and save people, not just guard the waters along the borders. This was criticized as being a magnet for migrants. But the evidence doesn't necessarily suggest that. There's plenty of push factors that would have pushed these people into the sea anyway. So, I mean, Europe should do everything it can, apart from search and rescue, apart from creating more legal channels for migration, to supporting whatever initiatives need to be supported and sending in transit countries to deal with the problem. It's not going to go away. It has to be dealt with in short-term and long-term planning.
And what would be some of the ways forward to help resolve this crisis?
Well, in terms of the economic push factors that I was talking about earlier from West Africa, I mean, there's nods towards what would be the best answers, but not full economic financial commitment. And that is increasing developments in sectors of these countries where a lot of the migrants are coming from. If it's economics, then people need work. You know, people need work. They need to earn a living that they can support families and have some amount of dignity in their life. Migration, in particular what we call irregular migration, is really just an effect of other facets of globalization that involve serious economic differences and inequalities. Migration is an effect of all that stuff. It's not just something that happens spontaneously.
Greg, anything else to add?
The structural economic inequalities are important. I mean, when trade deals are leveraged against, you know, African countries, for example, which certainly aren't to the advantage of people living there, you're going to get these kinds of migration flows. And to the extent that there's a neo-right reaction in the rich world against migrants, well, if they don't want them there, then, you know, start funding development programs seriously and take that kind of thing seriously. I mean, if that's going to be the conclusion that mainstream politics is going to draw, then that's how you deal with it. I mean, it's not like people want to leave their homes, right? Not that I'm supporting the neo-right here, but if that's your problem, here's a solution for you. You help people out economically.
Great. Well, Greg, I really appreciate your insight. Thank you so much for joining me on Imaginary Lines.
Thank you very much.
And now for a look at international media.
Bernie says that he's about the people, about grassroots movement. The biggest grassroots movement in this country right now is the Black Lives Matter movement. So right now, we are going to honor this space, and we are going to honor the memory of Michael Brown, and we are going to honor all of the Black lives lost this year, and we're going to honor the fact that I have to fight through all these people who said, my life matters!
On August 8th, U.S. presidential hopeful Bernie Sanders was interrupted during a rally in Seattle by two black women who jumped up on stage to draw attention to the plight of black people and continued violence at the hands of police. The action was quickly met with widespread condemnation, followed shortly by a defense of the action and sharp critiques of that very condemnation. The Black Lives Matter movement has been billed as the most important social movement in the United States today. However, the debate that emerged as a result of this action against Sanders has exposed what some are describing as weaknesses in that movement and what others have praised as a victory, especially since the very next day Bernie Sanders unveiled his policy platform to combat racial inequality.
Just recently, and we have seen it over and over and over again. Seen it with Sandra Bland, but we have seen it many, many times. That it is absolutely necessary to reform criminal justice in America. A person who commits a minor traffic violation, I think she forgot to put on her turn signal, should not be yanked out of her car, assaulted, handcuffed, put in jail, and die 3 days later. That's not what should happen when you commit a minor traffic violation. We must reform our criminal justice system. Black lives do matter, and we must value black lives.
Appropriate or not, the action prompted some of the worst media coverage of Black Lives Matter to date.
She was interrupted by demonstrators shouting Black Lives Matter.
What does it say about how this movement is determined to get its say, even if they have to knock people, legibly, more on their side than others off the stage?
In today's media landscape, the fallout from spontaneous and perhaps strategically questionable actions is all the greater. Emerging movements, especially those that represent a real threat to established power structures, have very little room for error. This points to another issue. In her defense of the action, Alicia Garza, credited as one of the founders of Black Lives Matter, said that the movement is a network whose chapters have autonomy. Such a structure inevitably opens the door for generalizations and attempts to discredit the movement, not to mention the lack of cohesion and unified tactics to challenge power. The Black Lives Matters movement continues to grow, and activists might need to grapple with some of these criticisms that have been highlighted during this most recent media coverage. As was seen last week, the actions that they choose will have a real effect on how they're seen and portrayed by members of the Democratic Party, the media, and the US public. And that's it for today's show. Thanks for watching. I'm your host, Michael Fox. Please join me next week.